We are learning that two Pima County Sheriff's Department employees will be terminated following an investigation into a missing K-9. You will remember PCSD K-9 Damon went missing back in late June. He was eventually found safe by a Good Samaritan, but we now know Kimberly Austin, a corrections officer and handler with the department, was responsible for caring for Damon at the time of his disappearance. PCSD confirms Austin and Tony Taylor, a sergeant with PCSD, both went in front of a disciplinary panel today and were placed on leave with pay pending those terminations. 13 News has requested the documents from that discipline panel to find out more information.